Hey everyone, I'm excited to welcome to Davidson Hang podcast. This is episode 114 with the one and only Christopher Paige. Welcome back on the show.
We got the Kingsway going on.
I love that. That's awesome.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so we connected because we had an interesting conversation about race last time, and we partnered together on the Redefining Masculinity. So check it out. Look up Redefining Masculinity on Amazon, and Chris was sharing with me some of his experience. He was actually in an Uber. He was speaking with an Uber driver who happened to be Asian, and just made him think a little bit more about just having this conversation. So yeah, I think this should be an interesting conversation in general.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, so I'm curious, what exactly about that conversation did you think made you kind of like, oh yeah, we should kind of have this conversation and kind of let the world into our world a little more.
Yeah. Well, so I jumped into this Uber one day and I try to, I feel like it can be an awkward space to be in an Uber if you're driving for a long time and not say anything.
True.
And I don't like to be the person that's just on the phone ignoring the driver because I'm like, this is an actual person
Hmm.
that's here, that's nice and safe. And, why not have a little conversation? So
Yeah.
somehow we ended up talking about the the incidences of anti-Asian hate and violence that's been happening.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I told you this before, but and I hope it doesn't seem disconnected, but I started studying Chinese when I was 6,
Wow.
and I studied Chinese for 4 years.
Wow.
My first teacher, Mrs. Shi, had just flown in from China.
Wow.
The day of class, I remember them saying they were picking her up from the airport, like she came with her bags.
Literally, that's crazy.
Yeah, and she just started speaking to us in Chinese, and I was like, does anyone? They know that we don't know it. Like we're gonna start. We were in a gifted program, so I was like, okay, we're gifted, but it doesn't.
Uh,
I don't have telekinesis or anything else. I can't just matrix this. Like, you know, like, and I learned so much from her, and it was funny because my one of my initial thoughts was that she looked like some people in my family.
Hmm.
And when you're multiracial, especially when you're younger, you still really don't have an idea of race and identity. So it was just one of those things. Like I thought she looks like my aunt Yolanda, actually.
Wow.
And so I think absorbing the culture because we the first thing I learned to cook was a wonton
Oh, that's
in
cool.
school. I was like, hey, I don't know if I should be. I don't know if you should trust me near heat. I don't know about this because I was like 6 when I started. But so the point is, I've always felt like all through my life, I've had some type of connection, more so with like the Chinese community. Um,
Hmm.
my sister speaks Japanese because in my town there was in New Brunswick, New Jersey, they renovated the library,
Oh
and
yeah.
behind the library they found a cemetery plot, and
Huh.
it was all in Japanese.
Wow.
So my town, New Brunswick, New Jersey, established. They found out where these folks were from, and they were from Fukui, Japan. So for years, my town and Fukui, Japan, have had a sister cities program
Huh.
where there's exchange students, and I was supposed to go. I didn't get a chance to go, but when they had students come in, I was usually one of the welcoming committees. So,
Huh.
we take them, show them around, we eat with them, um, and my sister. And for that reason, the same program that I came through when my sister went through the gifted program, they changed over to Japanese to kind of help with the sister city program. Kind of
That's
would help
cool.
if some of us could speak it.
Wow.
So so here's in my household, my sister and I are 9 years apart. So I studied Chinese, my sister studied Japanese.
Hmm.
Um, so I always kind of felt like exposure and understanding. So
Yeah,
anyway, not that that relates to actually speaking to the guy. There's just, I think, just normal. You should speak to the Uber driver and
that's
be
true.
nice to them. So we just started talking about what's going on, and it just occurred to me in the middle of the conversation, like, you know what? Maybe it's a maybe this is an overstep, but I wonder if he's ever talked to anybody else
Mm.
about how to deal with racism. And from what my friends and relatives that are of Asian descent, one thing I've always kind of known is pride.
Mm.
And that
Yep.
pride in the sense that I'm not just going to sit here and spill all my information.
Hmm.
If I'm dealing with something, I'm going to figure out how to deal with it. And that maybe that's just my view, but everything that I learned, because I mean, black culture is like that often too,
Hmm.
where you tough it out, but people will speak if
Right.
asked about things that are bothering them. And it occurred to me at that moment, I was like, you know what, maybe it's an overstep, but if this might be the one thing I can do.
Hmm.
So I just asked him, I was like, I know that it's a little crazy right now for everybody. And how are you dealing with this? I think that ever since Meghan Markle came out with the article about losing her baby, and she was saying about someone asking her, the interviewer at one interview asked her if she was okay, and that started the whole
Hmm.
snowball. And I've really been thinking, you need to ask people if they're okay. So that's what are you okay? I was like, hey, this is a safe space. It's your car.
Hmm.
And we talked and we had a very in-depth conversation and similar experiences.
Hmm.
And at the end of the ride, I was like, you know what? I need to be more conscious of this. And I need to reach out because this may be new for some people.
Hmm.
And if there are people of any Asian descent that I can reach and say, hey, look, I understand the fear. We might be afraid of different specific entities, but we need to talk about it.
Yeah, it's a good point. A lot of my black friends actually have reached out to me too, ever since the Atlanta shootings,
Yeah,
and we just understood each other. There was a level of we it wasn't even necessarily words. Like we were just looking at each other and just able to be with all of that.
yeah,
And it was a beautiful thing. There's a lot of people at LinkedIn that are black and that I became really close with, and
yeah,
it was, yeah, you're right. I think there is some pride, right? I think I think in general, like, no one was listening too, right?
yeah.
I mean, you have a lot of experience with that, right? From what you shared with me in the past. But not really. Not a lot of people care about the Asian experience. Sometimes it's a, well, you don't know how hard we have it. So sometimes there is that. I mean, that's rare, but sometimes you feel like, okay, well, shit. Like, even though we're having it hard, like, it's definitely not as bad as, like, I don't want to, like, say, but yeah. I mean,
No, okay, yeah,
yeah, so I definitely think that there's, like, that component of it. I think statistically speaking, right, like if you looked at just the numbers, like certain subgroups of Asians are doing well, like financially, but
yeah,
just because you're doing well financially doesn't mean you're doing well emotionally, mentally,
yeah,
um, and all that. So I think that's important to consider. I think similar, like a lot of Asians don't believe in mental health. Like they're like therapy, like that's for like privileged folks, or that's
yeah,
for like rich people, or it's like, oh, I don't have time. Like I'm too busy paying rent. Like I don't have time to think about these things.
yeah,
Those are some of the comments I have gotten when speaking with older Asian generation.
yeah. Well, I think too that like the older generations that we have right now, they're coming from a place of if someone's not running after me with a flamethrower,
Literally, yeah.
Like they're thinking my parents got through XYZ,
Yeah, yeah.
you
They've been
know,
through some shit.
and I can do this. I got this.
Right.
But it's so common among non-white communities in America, and even some subcultures of white communities,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
mental health seems like a luxury.
Mm.
Because you know what? We see it on TV. We see the stressed out billionaire on what is that show? Not Billions. Is it Billions?
Oh, billion. Yeah, it is billions. Yeah.
That goes to, and it's the shrink, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Then we see on procedural shows like Law and Order and CSI, whenever something happens, oh, you've got to go see the psychologist before you get put back on full duty. I don't need that. I'm good. And then they go into the session. So it's like this whole
Mm.
begrudging moment of I don't need to talk to anybody. And racial issues are traumatic.
Yeah.
Like the minute that it happens to you, or when you realize it can happen to you or someone you love, is mind blowing. Because I mean, especially think like I mean, I don't know if this happened to you when you were a little kid. When I was a little kid, especially like not really knowing what I was, and I grew up in a religious faith that taught like neutrality. So it was a very big thing in our faith. We didn't really discuss politics, and we didn't talk about race. It was everyone is a human. Everyone is equal. So I didn't even know what people were talking about when they were talking about race. And also being multiracial, I didn't really have a concept of being a specific thing. So if people were talking about, oh, this happened to black people or white people, I was just like, well, I mean, this looks like black to me, and I've never seen anybody like that complexion. And this is white to me, and I've never seen anybody that complexion. So I was just like, okay, I guess I'll understand it when I'm older. But the minute that that bubble is burst is traumatic,
Mm.
because you go from this moment of everything's fine and I can do whatever I want to and everything's great to I'm scared. I'm upset. I don't know what to do. I mean, I know when I think one of the most traumatic things about 2020 was that millions of people watched a man die on TV
Yeah.
and call up for his mom. And it went beyond race and everything. It was like, oh my God, there is a man, I'm watching a man die. And then I started thinking about somebody taped this. So somebody had to tape this to document it, but they also saw a man die. And multiple bystanders that couldn't do anything. So what my point is that what happens to us in racial terms, violence, brutality, injustice because of race, because of something you have no control over,
Yeah.
it's PTSD. It's exhausting. And so
Yeah.
every time you see it, it's like when I first saw the news about the Atlanta shooting, I was like, what is happening now?
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, the Atlanta, like similar to a lot of the like now that someone's recorded it, it's like makes it more. Or now that there's social media, people know about it. But I've always known of so many similar instances to Atlanta, just because I'm Asian, and
Yeah,
usually it's like they pay a fine and they pay like a couple $1,000 and they get off like scot free. That's like usually what happens.
yeah,
So it is nice to see that. Oh wow, there seems to be people paying attention now. So
yeah,
that's a great sign. You know, I think it's interesting because I think a lot of it's just like the history, right? You know, like even with the railroads, like not a lot of people know about that, right? And even like, so I'm Vietnamese, right? So, you know, like a lot of Asian countries have been colonized and we were basically slaves, right? Like we didn't have any control over anything really. And
Yeah,
people just exploit us for our resources and things like that. But, you know, you don't really learn about these things, and it's really hard to find content, right? Because the winner, or the people that hold the power, you know, are incentivized to not to hold a certain image or hold a certain story. So it is
yeah,
hard, you know, and it is also very uncomfortable to watch too sometimes. Like I was watching,
yeah,
and I'm surprised I never did this because I've actually never been to Asia, but
yeah,
I watched a documentary about more about the Vietnam War and like what exactly happened,
yeah,
and it is uncomfortable to watch like villages get raped, like 12-year-old get
yeah,
raped by like so many men, so many adults, and so many people, and like it's just like
yeah.
that's uncomfortable to watch, man. You know, like that's
Right.
it's very traumatic.
And I guess that's what got to me because I don't I was aware of some things like, like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the internment camps. And in my town, I always wondered why the library had been there for a long time. So I always wondered why those folks ended up living where they did because it's basically like almost like a forest behind the library. And then it occurred to me one day, I was like, maybe they were trying to keep on the low. And I just thought about like, wow, like it's so crazy that communities of color often don't know that much about each other.
Hmm. Yeah.
And we also, which I think is part of the problem,
Hmm.
um, I feel like some people that I've spoken to, especially like I lived in California, I lived in Los Angeles for 5 years, and you will encounter, depending what area you're in, you'll encounter a lot of Asian store owners.
Hmm.
And the interaction between the people in the community and the store owners sometimes is great, as with anywhere. But I have heard the concerned voice like it's, this is where I live and people have moved in and they have businesses. And what do we have? And it all has to do with not speaking about the elephants in the room.
Hmm.
Whether it's I kind of look at it like what you're saying before about, people talk about we've had it worse. And granted, the United States has a specifically tortured relationship with African Americans and with Native Americans.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, also descending from Native Americans, I mean, in school, learning about I don't know if you heard about this, but there is one of the ways that the American government decided to try to eradicate or decimate the number of Native Americans was by killing buffalo. And there's a picture of this general standing on top of a million buffalo heads
Wow.
with the simple purpose of starving people that were already here for, you know, land lust. And there needs to be more conversations because right now we're at a point where all of the elephants in the room,
Hmm.
their trunks are waving, and we just got to talk about it
Yeah.
because we're never going to move anywhere if we don't.
Hmm.
And I know that, I know in the Black community there is resentment from like other communities of color that move in and start succeeding. It's not about them moving in.
Hmm.
Because one thing that I will say about the Black community is that there's a large thing about acceptance and bringing people in because of knowing what it feels like to not be accepted. But there is the problem of, okay, that seems you.
Nice.
good, good
Yeah.
catch on the mute though. Good move on the mute because I would have been like, "Where's the mute?" So you know he's a good podcaster, folks. So, so that's actually one of the reasons I really, really wanted to talk to you because it was like we just don't walk out of those boxes that we live in, even though we kind of want to.
Yeah.
And when I saw that, I think that what you were saying about things that have happened in the past, violence toward Asians, is not something that people know about because
Right.
that's enlightening to me. I've always known that there's been, I mean, who doesn't know there's been prejudice?
Right.
Um, but I was watching, so to give you a thought, I was watching when COVID first came out. I remember that there was a commercial on Channel 7, I believe, and it was various communities that fall under the Asian moniker. And it was everything from like, like some Middle Eastern folks to, Chinese, Japanese, um, various distinctions in the Asian community. And so one person said that, oh, people just think I'm a genius or something like that. People just think I'm smart or they expect me to be smart. And my instant reaction was like, I wouldn't mind if somebody thought I was smart. I'd rather someone think I'm smart than dangerous.
Right.
But then I thought about it and I was like, you know what? Um, this is a bizarre example, but I like to use it because I think it makes a lot of sense when you put it in perspective. So I was watching years ago. I mean, I would admit it if I was a fan of this show, but I just really actually never get a chance to watch it. I probably would. Um, but the Kardashians show. So the deal was that Kim had asked for, she had bought this like designer car and it was supposed to be, I believe it was supposed to be pink.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, the
Yeah.
point is that it didn't come out the way that she wanted. And so she's like, crying in tears. And so many people were reacting to that saying, oh my God, like this is so ridiculous. Like you're crying because your $100,000 car didn't come out right. But I said to my friend, because I was trying to understand, and I said, if you've always had money and you've grown up around money and millions aren't a thing for you, you went to the car dealer. This is your frame of reference. I've always had everything. And when I get stuff, when I pay for stuff, I expect it. And this time I paid for it and it frustrated me that it didn't come out. So I'm crying about it. So
Yeah.
that was like the worst thing that happened to her that year,
Mm-hmm.
right? Yes, it does seem ridiculous if you're like someone that's making, $15 an hour and struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah.
But that's her frame of reference. So I think that's also something that we don't speak about, that like I can't judge you from your frame of reference.
Right.
I need to understand your frame of reference.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it's a conversation we have that happens in the African American community, the communities of brown folks, because you know for some black people I'm fair skinned,
Yeah.
but for most of the people that I am around who are white, I am dark.
Right.
Um, so there are people in the communities of color, especially in the black community, who automatically assume that I have things easier because I fall in that ethnically ambiguous category where I could be, it's for most people, they are able to observe that I'm some type of a mix. And that's a
Yeah.
different.
I was reading Alicia Keys' biography, and she explained it pretty well because she's mixed as well. I
Yeah.
think her, but Yeah, it was interesting because I think she ended up marrying like Swiss Beats,
Yeah,
and then he pointed out something that really like was like an aha moment for her. But she's like, you know what's interesting, Alicia? Like I never once hear you say acknowledge that you're part of being white, right? Like you always own the black part of you, right? And then first she was like defensive. She's like, what do you mean? And then after she took some time to think about it, she's like, you're right. Like I don't. I'm always I always acknowledge that I'm black.
yeah,
Um, but yeah, to go back to your yeah, I mean, I think comparing is like always like not good, right? I think it's interesting because like if it wasn't for BLM, I don't think I would be as interested about learning about histories. So I took the initiative to learn about like I read Muhammad Ali's, Arthur Ashe's biography, Mike Tyson's biography, so Malcolm X, MLK. Like I started really diving deeper because I was just curious about like, well, I live in this supposedly this great country called America. Like, let me learn more about yeah, and then at LinkedIn, there was a Hispanics of LinkedIn, so I used to attend a lot of Hispanics of LinkedIn events. So
yeah,
now, this year I like want to learn a little bit more about that, right? But it's interesting because even within my own heritage, like Asians, like there's just not a lot of literature about it, right? Like if I wanted to learn about Black history, there's literally like thousands and thousands of books I can go to bookstore and find. But I remember I went to the bookstore the other day and there was like one or two books about the Asian experience, and
yeah,
I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like that's interesting because considering we make up like a third of the population of the world, right?
yeah,
Um, so yeah, like it is interesting. I think there's a lot. I would say, and I can only speak from the male experience, and obviously I'm not representing every Asian male, right? But I think the thing that a lot of Asian males deal with is just like the lack of masculinity framed by media and our culture, and
yeah,
from a from a dating standpoint, it really sucks, so that is something that's interesting that not a lot of people talk about, quite
yeah,
honestly. um so I would say just more from like a romantic love life. I think that's like the main thing that sucks for a lot of Asian men. And then I would say just from a yeah, I guess from like a corporate America standpoint, there's just like not a lot of like Asian men who are like in executive leadership roles.
yeah,
So just from modeling, it's just like it's hard to see yourself in that if you just don't see it. Whereas like I would say, I don't know, it does seem like from American culture, like the black community has had a lot of success in multiple like at the top tiers, right? There does seem to be like representation, which
yeah,
I so it does seem that like just at like the most elite levels of like media, TV, and all that, like it'd be hard to like not see any like successful black men and
yeah,
et cetera, right? So I would say like that's just my interpretation of why it is challenging to be like an Asian male in our society.
yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned that because the like what you're saying about Alicia Keys, like an issue with like being multiracial is that often people in various communities force you to make some kind of a decision as to who you're going to represent, as if you're like a delegate for all of the cultures that you're from. And it's like, okay, hard, fast decision. Who are you supporting? Like, oh, do I get a T-shirt? Like, how does this work? Like,
Yeah.
but um, I mean, I understand that perspective. Just even thinking about that. I mean, let's think about like the Black experience is very much uh, uh, a creation of the United States,
Yeah.
right? Because anyone that claims Blackness, you really don't have. I mean, aside from if you've used Ancestry.com,
Hmm.
you really don't have a country to come from.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah.
you are a product of the United States. Like it's not like you
Hmm.
can say. I mean, for me, like with my ancestry, like I'm able to look back and I know where the German came from. I know where the Italian came from. I know where the
Mm.
but even the Native American parts, like those, that history is hard to access.
Mm.
And the problem is, if we continue to be baseless and separated, we're still going to be governed by the few people we have in front of us. Like, it shouldn't be, arguably, it shouldn't be that there were Asian people killed, or that was, or Dante Wright was a black child. It should be people. There are humans that lost their life because another human had
Yeah.
disregard.
Yeah.
But that's work that the communities of color, I feel, have to step up and accept that
Mm.
we are. I mean, Davidson, America in 2060 is going to look more like you and me
Mm.
than
True.
than the people that were contained in the Mayflower. It's already
Yeah.
doing that.
Yeah, it's so true. It's a beautiful thing that, every day I look on social media and I see my friends having biracial, multiracial babies, right? It warms my heart because, like, I mean, that's one way to connect us, right? um,
Yeah.
and at the same time, we have so much work to go, right? I do think it is more common, like you said, that our own race will be more curious and more supportive of our own race, but it is rare to see like true allyship, you
Yeah.
know, unless it's like just someone that you're close to. But at a macro level, like we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
But in a way, like I'm not saying like what happened in Atlanta is a good thing, but at least it brings us closer together. That's like, okay, like 4,000 people have had hate crimes in the last year because of COVID, or Asians have had hate crimes because. So okay, at least now I can like feel that, okay, like you have gone through like, I would say like boot camp as well, right? Like welcome to the club type of thing.
Yeah.
um because I've always seen it, right? Like being Asian, I was always bullied, I was always picked on, but how do I communicate that, right? It's hard to, and it, like you said, it's traumatizing to bring that up again. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, did the hundreds of hours of therapy, like that was good enough? Like I don't want to have to like explain it to all of my white friends again, like
Yeah.
that's it's annoying to have to do that.
But it's also like, um in the piece of song that I'm writing, I explained to an associate of mine, I would say a friend, or we're somewhere between a friend and an associate. I'm getting to know this person better. That if your friend had been kidnapped, even for a day, if your friend had been kidnapped, I doubt that people would ask them about the kidnapping experience every single time.
Mm, yeah,
At
yeah,
dinner, at a party, like, hey, how's your cocktail? Hey, how was being kidnapped?
right.
But for some reason, we don't understand. It's not supported that racial trauma needs support. Racial trauma is mentally taxing. And if we don't deal with it, and we don't deal with it together, it's going to continue. And it's going to continue throughout all of our communities.
Hmm.
I think for me, like, what also made me want to talk about this was that, like, I was looking at some of the folks that were arrested, like at least in our area, for Asian hate crimes, and I saw people of color,
Hmm.
and I just thought about this whole dichotomous. Okay, so you had a disproportionate amount of Black and Latino people that contracted COVID and then died from COVID,
Yeah.
and misinformation. So you combine that, and I'm not excusing anything. I'm just thinking of, like, what would even make you do that, because I just know from, like, kind of something innate in the Black community. It's like, the hurt, so you don't. want to perpetuate it onto another race because you know it. It's a
Right.
constant, it's a constant fear.
Yeah.
So it was like when I saw that there were, folks in the communities of color, brown people doing this as well,
Yeah.
just made like it hurt because I was like, no, like this
Yeah.
is why we need to talk because you have, you know, you have these divides and you have people that prey upon the divides to use
Mm.
misinformation
Mm.
to create a chasm.
Mm.
So, if you have, because to be honest, like in the Black and Latino community, there were people in the beginning of COVID that I heard it. I mean, not personally from people that I know, but I heard on the news and people speaking. This, there was actually a belief that this wasn't something that affected Black people
Mm.
because for some ways or some ways that it was communicated out to people, it was almost like this is something that Chinese people get.
Mm.
So I'm not Chinese, so I'm not going to get it, which is a ridiculous idea. But if you have, all you need is one person to say that.
Yeah.
And then, I was even in the store, like, oh, I'm not worried about that. Black people don't get that.
Oh, really? Wow.
What?
That's I never heard that one. It's an interesting topic you bring up. Because I've thought about this, right? Being someone who's Asian, who looks Asian, right? But I've never been to Asia in my life, so it's
Yeah.
interesting how society. It's like, oh yeah, you're Asian, of course, right? So they identify. So of course I'm labeled as Asian according to everyone else, right? But
Yeah.
my wife brought this up to me because and I thought it was interesting. She's like I think you're actually like more black than you are Asian in a lot of ways. I'm like yeah, because I grew up in America, right?
Yeah.
So and then because I didn't come from wealth or anything like that, like I identify with a lot of the music and the culture because that's how I grew up. Like
Yeah.
all everyone in my apartment buildings was people of color and black
Yeah.
and brown. The struggles of having to deal with a lot of this stuff, right? Like kind
Yeah.
of hustling to make my way up to
Yeah.
make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck. Like I identify with a lot of that music, right? And it's an interesting realization. But my wife brought it up because she's like you listen to like 90 like pretty much 99% of the music you listen to is like black like mostly black people, right? And I'm like, oh, I haven't thought of it that way, right? But like to your point, because I'm inherently American, right?
Yeah.
So it is sad to when my family and my friends like are afraid to go out because they think they're gonna get murdered or they have to buy
Yeah.
like weapons just because of media and stuff. And
Yeah.
it's just it's sad, it puts me in a weird situation because I'm like, well, I guess I'm Asian because everyone else tells me I'm Asian, but according to Asian people I'm not Asian enough because I don't really speak, you know what I mean, like i'm
Yeah.
i'm not really that Asian. So you're kind of stuck. I mean, it sounds like you can relate. You're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place where you're like, well, shit, like white people
Yeah.
don't ever think I'm American and Asians don't think I'm Asian because I quite frankly have never been there, so I don't even know what that's like.
Yeah.
So it is a tricky place to be in. You're like, you just don't feel like you belong anywhere.
Yeah. And what makes that even that what I think makes that even trickier is whether you believe you have to make a decision or not, like whether you believe you have to check that box. And but there's so many constructs here in our life that force us to. I remember I in college I was working at the Gap, and so I had to finish my paperwork. And so there's always something extra you have to fill out when you work at a part-time job. Working at a part-time job, I feel like starting a part-time job is, yep.
Uh,
So when you start working at a part-time job, there's always 500 pieces of paperwork that you have to do, and you have to bring in your blood samples and your platelets and everything possible. It's like I think working full time, I've never had to do as much stuff as I needed to do for like a part-time job, sell jeans. So I had to sit down at this computer and I had to finish this work. And it had a space, it had asks the question about your background. And you couldn't
Hmm.
pass the page without making a choice. And so I looked at the woman and I was like, I'm multiracial. So what
Hmm.
it would not give me an option to select
Hmm.
multiple backgrounds. So she
Yeah.
said, and this was, a kind of very corporate Caucasian lady. And I just say that because of the perception. And she was like, well, what's your father? And I'm like, are we going to do this? Because that's often with being multiracial people, depending on what part of your culture you're talking to, it
Hmm.
they figure what you are by what your father is or what your mother is.
Hmm.
Um, which I'm like, I am a whole person, not a recipe.
Hmm.
But it really made me think about this whole thing about for I think it's become a very American thing, and that's I don't know how it can change. That we need to figure out immediately what box a person fits in before we proceed.
Hmm.
And I think about I was in the bus in California, and this lady just turned to me and she was like, "What is you?" And I think the phrasing of it and also the abruptness, because I've never seen her in my life.
Yeah.
I never
Yeah.
saw her on a bus.
Crazy.
And I was like, I'm sorry, I'm what? I'm a human sitting next to you.
Yeah.
Then she was like, but is you black or white? I'm like, well, clearly I'm in my head. I'm like, clearly I'm not white.
What was she? I'm curious.
What is it?
What ethnicity was she?
I think that she was black,
Oh, okay.
but it was
Oh.
just such a funny thing because I was like, it was apropos to nothing. We didn't have a conversation going. We were
Hmm.
just sitting on the bus together,
Yeah.
and what I realized, it's something I've come to this realization of, whether it's being multiracial, whether it's being, and this is another topic for another day, but whether it's being like underweight or overweight,
Hmm.
there's certain spaces of identity that people feel if if you somehow present them a question that you are bad, your remorse should be shown by being ready to explain who you are at a moment's notice because, well, you're mixed, you should know what you are. You should know how to
Hmm.
respond to this. Um, but I mean, I think like, you know, as far as an issue, there's the economics involved in it too. Because if you look at the Black and Latino communities in America, oftentimes the Black and Latino communities have lived in the same spaces. So the economic
Hmm.
disparities are shared. And
Hmm.
there's a difference of language, but I think
Hmm.
that the Black community has, I don't say an affinity, but like it's almost like Latinos are especially Caribbean Latinos, and I think more so Caribbean Latinos are kind of like cousins
Hmm.
because they're
Yeah.
especially Caribbean folks. I mean, especially if you look at like Dominicans, Cubans,
Hmm.
you'll find folks that if they didn't speak, you would assume that they're African American
Hmm.
until you hear them speak.
Yeah.
Um, but I think for the African American community, it's been an issue of seeing other folks come in and maybe not making the acknowledgement of oneness or sameness. And
Hmm.
where I find that interesting as well is within the South Asian community, like in the Indian community.
Yeah.
I've had actually a lot of interesting conversations, especially with the rise of Kamala Harris,
Hmm.
of speaking to Asian Indian folks, especially darker Asian Indian folks,
Hmm.
who like the experience is like, wow, yeah, we've been living similar lives. And you
Hmm.
don't even realize it because I think when you look at American communities of color, I think that people often assume that Asian Indians, the Asian Indian community, and like Chinese, Japanese, Korean have money,
Right.
or they're able to come here and not have like police brutality, and
Yeah.
they're able to thrive because they seem more docile.
Mm. Yeah.
And to be honest, I really think that a lot of people in the communities, the brown community, don't know that much about other, except for, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, don't really know that much about even what Asian means.
Right.
Like, what other communities are involved in the Asian community? Because I
Yeah.
think
It's it's
there's such a
it's
singular experience that we get stuck in just trying to live our own experience, and it's almost
mm,
like, okay, who else is going to come in and be next in the list above us? I mean,
hmm.
that's not how I feel. But I'm just saying that the discussions I've had with some people have led me to understand that that's where sometimes the divide is.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a that's a deep topic. It's interesting, right? Because I'm Vietnamese, and I would say like Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnamese, like Filipinos, a lot of like I guess like the lower status Asians, I guess, or even Asian within Asians, or even within South Asians, there's like different castes and different tiers. But
Yeah,
I would say like you're right, like the Koreans, the Japanese, and I would say like the Taiwanese people and people
yeah,
from Shanghai, like they're definitely like wealthier, right? Like it's hard to generalize, but like just like a rule of thumb, like they paid to get to come here, right?
yeah,
So I think it's like the war torn countries like in
yeah,
Vietnam and Cambodia and like I guess the darker skinned Asians, I would say
yeah,
like we're usually the ones that are like screwed or live in more of like the black and brown communities and
yeah,
don't have a lot of wealth, right? So
yeah,
I can only speak from Vietnamese, but all of my Vietnamese friends like have never met their fathers or never had a father. Or, we all have like a similar background, living off of government assistance, food stamps. Was embarrassed to use food to get free lunch or discounted lunch just because like
yeah,
everyone knows when you're that kid.
yeah,
So we all have that shared experience, right? But yeah, but I feel like not a lot of people know that, right? Like I think when you
yeah. No, I mean
speak of
that's
Asians, you're like, oh yeah, they come from money,
yeah, and I mean, conversely, and it's interesting that in my life I've realized I've accepted my privileges. I'm the darkest in my immediate family, um, and I mean, even my mom was often not, visually. My parents didn't present specifically as anything black or not. My dad was skin like milk, red hair, and the classic Roman nose. So he just kind of went into this ambiguously. We don't really know what it is. So my mom, it's interesting. Like people in my neighborhood always thought my mom was Polynesian, which I thought I was like, for a New Jersey town, that's actually you know, pretty advanced for them to even know about Polynesian.
know. Yeah, I was gonna say.
Because I remember there were a few neighbors that always randomly would say, what island is your mother from again? I'm like, the island of North America. Like, my mother hasn't even flown anywhere. My
Oh
mother
wow.
hates planes, so she did not come from anywhere. But it was funny because, I mean, you could tell my eyes aren't super big, um, but my mom's eyes were very slanted,
Mm,
and just in presentation, my parents didn't evoke. People really never thought of them as black. they knew, especially my mom, that she must be something that had some kind of melanin, or I think, as someone told me one time, that she looked like she came from someplace warm. But yeah, what does that mean? Like, look like you're close to the sun. Like, what does that mean? But
Yeah.
I lived a great life. I grew up in New Brunswick, where Rutgers is, and I remember in school, kids would say weird things to me, like, "Oh, you have recycling." I'm like, what do you mean? I have everyone. They're like, "Well, they don't in our part of town. They don't give us the recycling cans because
Right. Yeah.
that part of town." I'm like, that's ridiculous. So,
Hmm.
like but the funny thing is that I would meet people, like when I was, I was probably the only homecoming king that was also on the math team. So I would go to math events, and people would say, like, they were just like amazed that I was there. And it was like, do you realize what you're saying? And
Hmm.
so it's funny because I'm thinking of what you're saying, and then when people would meet me, they would assume that that I lived in the projects or something,
Hmm.
also because of my town.
Yeah.
New Brunswick was a great town, but at a certain point there was something called the White Flight. There were race riots that happened in New Brunswick, and then kind of
Wow.
like people fleeing the city because of COVID. I don't know what they thought that was going to do,
Hmm.
but um, there were these like after the race riots happened in the 60s, there was a big exodus of white people. So
Oh, I didn't know that.
it created, not because of the race, but because of who left. It obviously created a change in the taxes paid and such. So there
Hmm.
was a while where the school system wasn't considered that great. Um,
Oh.
but they created this incredible gifted and talent program, partly because of my mother. And
Hmm.
so what ended up happening was that I had these great, amazing experiences, like, and people never connected it to my town or to me,
Hmm.
because you know I'd say I got my painting sold at the Schomburg. It was auctioned off.
Wow.
What school? What school are you in? New Brunswick? What? Well, you must be in private school. You live in New Brunswick, right? When I went to Rutgers, which is in New Brunswick,
Yeah.
I had professors tell me, you went to, especially like I studied English, so like you went to private school, right? I was like, no, I was in a gifted program in New Brunswick. What? So it was always kind of like, I guess people, I don't know if it's better to have people, it's probably a similar stress.
Right. It's
You know,
yeah, I think it's more like, well, it's hard to be anything different. Well, people just have assumptions, like usually like when people learn about like they just assume like certain things. Like there's a lot of assumptions, I would say, right? So whether it's like wow, you've experimented with drugs, I would never think that, or like wow, like, or people just copying my homework off, but it's like I was horrible at school, like I was like the opposite. I like almost failed out of Rutgers. And it's funny, so we actually live in North Brunswick now, actually. So
wow.
yeah, yeah.
Both my parents have passed away, but their houses, and my sister lives in the house. She has a house now, and it's in New Brunswick. Or I went to Rutgers. It was so funny. I would just like walk to school. I
Wow.
walked to high school, and I would walk to college. And
Wow.
I didn't even grasp that Rutgers was like known, because if you live in New Brunswick as a child, you can go study at Rutgers libraries. So I've been in the
Oh.
library and on all over campus all my life. So it was like
Wait,
normal.
what street did you live on? Because I know New Brunswick pretty well.
Fulton. I was between Remsen and Livingston on Fulton Street.
Oh yeah. I lived on Brookside.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was, yeah, down more toward, yeah.
Yeah.
In college we had a great house in
Oh
um,
yeah. I
Huntington Street, and
That was
the
my Asian fraternity was on Huntington. Yeah.
and the great thing was that we had this house that we didn't really have neighbors on our left side, and then the owner of the house was like the mayor of Warren. So
Whoa.
nothing like we never got in trouble for anything. And then I worked, two of us worked for campus police, so we had the,
Oh,
best time. I really would miss that place.
yeah,
But
I love Rutgers. Yeah,
yeah, it's definitely, you know,
good time.
are you, rah, rah,
Good
rah.
times. Yeah.
But you know, like I think that where we're at is all of these conversations.
Hmm.
It, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to say, you know what, I need to look at my circle,
Mm-hmm.
and I need to say, you know what do I know about my friends? What do they know about me? You know, because until you just said that about you, I didn't have any specific assumptions about like how you grew up.
Mm-hmm.
But I am not trying to put on the airs, but I feel like I had everything I wanted and more. And my dad was the director of transportation for Revlon. My mother was like a field director for the Census Bureau.
Hmm.
I never wanted, and I always had, you know, always had, and I didn't take it for granted because I just knew, like, I just am that type of person. I just don't need a lot of fanfare. But
Hmm.
my dad's family is definitely like well off. We were like the poorest in the family, so it was like, oh, you don't have a pool.
Yeah.
You know, that was the thing. You don't have a pool, and you don't have a W. But in speaking about that, I think that it has to be something that all of us do. There has to be some kind of substantive effort.
Hmm.
Like, I mean, I've never seen, until maybe recently, I've never really seen like outward, tangible, substantive cooperation
Hmm.
from like the Black and Asian communities.
Yeah. You're
And
right.
it's those connections because, you know, like, um, I think if I didn't grow up the way that I did with exposure to Chinese and Japanese culture, that I probably would feel a little bit different, you know?
Hmm.
But I mean, like
Yeah.
when I first heard about this thing, it just automatically, my antennae went up. I was on the train the other day and I saw women, three Chinese women. And some guy came on and he looked crazy, like crazy nuts.
Hmm.
And my first thought was like, I need to sit here. Like, I don't know what I can do, but I need to sit
Hmm.
here so that if I can deter anything, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like having those conversations like, this is not, you can't be alone in this because
Hmm.
I want you to see if if a policeman stops me and has me apprehended, I want you to notice. I
Hmm.
want you to care,
Hmm.
you know? Or if anything happens to any of us, it doesn't have to be like anything's even like racially related. Like if you see something happening to somebody, we have to
Hmm.
be at a point, especially communities of color, because when something happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. And we've been
It's.
so divided that we don't recognize that because you know what?
Hmm.
Yeah, there are people that like specifically don't like a certain specific race,
Right.
but people that do things against a race, eventually that expands.
Hmm.
You know, I know a guy who was a he was a police officer and he had an incident where a woman, like, he basically says she specific like deliberately fell on him, and she's a really heavy woman, and it like he ended up having neck injuries, like surgeries and all this stuff.
Jeez.
And I've seen his change,
Hmm.
which is kind of weird because I'm like, you do realize that I have to be at least part black, right?
Yeah.
Or something that's not white. Like, well, I don't even know why I know this from you, but
Hmm.
that I've seen that develop into when you plant that seed once of someone of a specific background did something bad to me, so I'm going to not like that background.
Hmm.
It festers.
Yeah.
It festers. And that's why I think, you know, being men of the pen, maybe
Hmm.
that's where we can come in. Maybe
Hmm.
that's where we can expose these experiences and show substantive cooperation,
Hmm.
not for not to look good, not for, you know, impress or just to be nice, but actually we're all human and we have similar experiences whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
And if I fight for something and I fight for a right, it trickles down to all of us. I was
Yeah.
having a conversation with an old friend of mine, and she was saying that I think having any blackness in you, there's something that goes off when anyone is bothered in a racial way. And she was
Hmm.
talking about how she had a class where the professor said something to an Asian student. It was a photography class, and the professor said something to an Asian student, basically intimating, well, don't you guys take pictures a lot anyway? Digging
Huh.
into like the whole like New York, like 42nd Street tourist, like,
Yeah, yeah.
and she was
Wow.
like, she picked it up before the Asian student that it was said to, and
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
professor said it to the entire class. And
Wow.
she actually went up to the person afterwards, and she was like, "If like I heard that, and if you need me to be here with you, like
Mm.
I'm here with you. That was wrong." And she said something to the professor, like, "What do you? Are you actually saying this?"
Yeah.
And it's what, it's going to be tiring. It's going to be a little exhausting. But I think that for the next generation, even just for us, you know what I mean? Like I want to be able to go outside and know that I can nod at you, I can smile at you, and you really
Yeah.
feel like, you know what? We are brethren. And it's not like an against white people thing either, because
Right.
you have this whole faction of white people that are good, that want to like be part of things, and they don't know how to, because
Mm.
they know that if they say something that is taken the wrong way,
Hmm.
a lot of people are going to react.
Mm.
I just think that's what's, I don't even know if it's governmental that we could do it or organizationally,
Hmm.
but there needs to be this exchange of experiences, because you know what, even though you and I know each other, I think we just had more of a connection now, just talking about things that people have expected of us.
Yeah.
I told you before, I think I've told you before about the interesting reactions when at work, previous jobs, I was going out with somebody who was very powerful, millionaire,
Mm-hmm.
and who told me, um, he got jealous about something, and then he was like, "I'm going to go to your job and tell them that you're bi." And I was like, "I'm a ballroom dance instructor. People are going to be surprised that I even go out with women. Like, you're not, you
Hmm.
would more blow their mind with that than the idea that I go with guys."
Hmm.
The first week, I said something to my managers just to say like, "Hey, like this person thinks they're coming in to make trouble. I'm just gonna let's get out of the bag." And the
Mm-hmm.
um, first week, people ask questions and everything, but then it became, when they used to tell me before to calm down, when I was fervent about a point, and
Hmm.
even in that, it was sort of like being one of the darker people on the team. Why can't I just be fervent about my point? Like, why am I
Hmm.
angry or out of control?
Mm. Yeah.
Then it became, you need to not stop being so sensitive. You're being hypersensitive.
What's
Just
that?
you got to be
Gaslighting?
more.
Is that the terminology for this?
Yeah, but it was like the shift of, okay, wait, you used to think because of like outward appearance that I'm aggressive, and
Hmm.
now not agreeing with you is because I'm not fully a man. I mean, in that position, I was actually introduced to a client as the feminine one on the team.
Jesus.
And I was like,
Yeah.
hey, has nothing to do, you're bringing someone in for business, and I don't know why you're even introducing them to me. That's your client. But we need to speak about these things, because all of these preconceived ideas interrupt the life we could be having.
Yeah. Wow, yeah, you just said a lot there. But yeah, it is interesting because I noticed and I didn't even realize I had this unconscious bias, but I recognize that it's easier for me to connect with people of color. Like I just naturally gravitate towards people of color, like everywhere and everywhere I've gone since high school because of I think of just like you said some more like traumatic moments I've had with
Yeah,
racism and microaggressions. And then I realized I set myself up in a world where I pretty much only hung out with people of color. And
yeah,
I was like, huh, I'm shooting myself in the foot with like the majority of still the US is still white, right? So I'm like I'm even if let's say 50% is the ratio in New York City,
yeah,
but that's half of millions of people that I'm not in almost like I'm not intentionally opening myself up to, right?
yeah,
So I had that realization and I was like, wow, like I don't want that. Like that's fair. Like I'm making a lot of assumptions here even about like
yeah,
white privilege. Like granted, yes, like there is a lot of privilege in New York City, Manhattan in general,
yeah,
but still like I'm not letting myself get to know someone beyond things just right off the bat, and that was
yeah.
like really powerful realization for me.
I think also that sometimes can be self-preservatory because I'll give you another thing to think about that I was actually thinking about this before, and when I was, writing the piece I was telling you about, that in most situations I've been in, both academically and secularly, I'm rarely. I heard myself saying one time that I'm usually the darkest person in the room, and I started thinking like, well, I'm not the darkest person in America, and I realized not even from choice, but just from happenstance, basically everybody in my world is white.
Hmm.
And I think that, and I started to think like, well, am I overly aware of my background because of that? And, like white or like white presenting. So I have, I have a lot of Latino friends, but again, I'm usually the darkest
Hmm.
and, the most like ethically questionable.
Hmm.
Um, and it's been like for me because growing up multiracial, I think that people in the communities of color were less apprehensive about asking me about what I was
Hmm.
and stating their thoughts on it. And also, like when you walk into a situation and you're multiracial, I find that a lot of people, unless they visually don't present as something that they think that you're part of, like some ethnicity that they're just looking at you like kind of like I doubt he's anything from me. Like I don't think he's my cousin.
Hmm.
So I think I've almost gelled more because of experiences I've had in the past. And it's not that I didn't, but especially corporate America kind of pits if there isn't a policy of inclusion. There's this thing called, the whole 110% thing. Like you have to be. There's a very common expression in Black culture about you have to be 100%, 110%
Yep.
of what everybody else is because the assumption is people are going to assume that you have
Hmm.
less ability.
Yep. It's the
And when I
same
went
thing
into
in Asian culture too, actually. Like because
yeah,
we're perceived as not as assertive, and we can't like we don't have the typical leadership skills of speaking up and taking space. We have to be better because of that. So, and
yeah,
then also the thing that well shit I'm the only hire of Asian descent, so if this doesn't work out they're never gonna hire another Asian person again,
yeah.
so that's a common thought as well.
And isn't that crazy that it's like you think about millions of people you walk into this shop and you're like, oh my God, I can't be, there's three of us. There's three of us. And
Yeah, yeah. There's only two of we. So me and this other, we just saw it. Because I just started at this company and it has
yeah,
240 people, and we're the only two Asians. Because he's been with the company forever. He was one of the. So he's like, yeah. I'm actually you're the second. Now I'm not the only one out of 240, and I was like, wow,
yeah.
that's pretty astonishing. And he's like it's actually worse where I'm at too. Like it's very rare, And I was like, wow.
And you know what's funny about that? So I work in the school system, and I work in a small school, and I've been there for 4 years, and I am finally now not the only man of color. And
Wow.
the craziest thing is that he and I have the same last name.
Wow.
And a little fun fact: anyone that is has the name Paige, I'm not related to, because my dad's name this is another story for another day. But my dad's name is actually Page.
uh,
That's his family name, but he was
mm,
separate. He was born out of wedlock, and when that I
mm,
guess when that happened, that was a huge no.
mm.
So they apparently told people that he was a distant relative. So every time I meet somebody that's Paige, they're like, "Oh my God, I don't know any other pages." I'm like, "Sorry to burst your bubble, but we're not related." But
Yeah.
it's too funny. Like I was just looking around one day and I'm like, there's one black lady that works here. There are there's one Latino lady that works in my school, and there's me. I check all boxes. And then there's one, actually, you know what? I take that back. There is a, oh, actually, he's new too. So now we have three men of color
Mm.
of any background.
Wow.
Now, unless there's somebody that might be like a Latino mix that I don't know about.
Right.
I think I'm in New York City.
Yeah.
Like,
Crazy.
doesn't that sound like a weird thing?
It's crazy, man. It's so crazy.
But
It's
there's
nuts.
there's I think it was 8%. Only 8% of the staff in New York City is are like the teaching staff are men of color,
Yeah.
but 45% of the male students in New York City are of color.
It's crazy. What it's like mind blowing, right? Like it's hard to even comprehend that. Like I just don't get
But
it.
yeah, you know what? Thus is the point, because you know what I think. Like I think we're so used to thinking that things are better than the proverbial past, and it's like no, actually things started being better, and then a lot of people got used to things being better and not really unfortunately not understanding, like, okay, there's still work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
I think there's a new congresswoman, Corey Bush, and her first day in Congress wore a Breonna Taylor mask.
Hmm.
And I'll send you this interview, but she said that so many people walked up to her and said, "Welcome to Congress, Breonna." And she was like,
Ah, it's so
they
sad.
don't they didn't even know
Ah,
who he was.
it's so sad.
She was introduced on the floor, like, and you're sitting here like, how do you
Th-
not know
It
this?
it's that's crazy. Yeah.
But
People
I
are
think
in
that,
their own bubbles. There's a lot of bubbles out there. But this conversation is it's a good one because I think a lot of people will learn from it. But
yeah.
yeah, man. Well, thank you so much for being open and honest and just creating the space. I felt like we had like a really interesting conversation that I think a lot of people will get a lot out of it. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, just want to say thank you.
Looking forward to the next one.
Yeah, there'll be many more. Cheers.
See you later.